August 1961. The lake was flat and the weather was clear. The Navy's survey vessel Pursuit had been anchored for 3 days above the deepest section of Lake Michigan, a section of the lake floor northwest of Milwaukee that the Navy's hydrographic records from the late 1950s had identified as anomalous in ways that the standard lake survey data from the Army Corps of Engineers did not address. The lake's maximum documented depth at that point was approximately 923 feet. The Pursuit's own depth soundings, conducted during the first 2 days at anchor, suggested a section of the lake floor at that location that continued below the 900-foot mark in a manner inconsistent with the gradual tapering profile characteristic of glacial lake basin topography. On the morning of August 7, 1961, 3 Navy divers descended from the Pursuit's deck in a submersible bell to conduct a direct visual inspection of the anomalous section. Their names were Petty Officer First Class Gerald Raymond Hollis, Engineman Second Class Frank Devereaux, and Petty Officer Third Class Albert Yuen Cheng. They carried camera equipment, sample bags, 2 sets of lights, and 2 hours of compressed air. The descent took approximately 40 minutes. They reported by telephone line to the surface throughout, and when they surfaced approximately 2 hours and 14 minutes after descent, 14 minutes past their air window, which required a supplemental air supply to be passed down through the bell's umbilical, the 3 accounts they gave of what they had seen in the lowest section of the descent were not the same account. Hollis and Devereaux described what they had seen. Cheng said nothing. He was medically evaluated on the deck of the Pursuit. He was transferred by helicopter to the Naval Air Station at Glenview within 4 hours of surfacing. He did not speak on the Pursuit's deck, during the helicopter transfer, or at Glenview, where he was kept under medical observation for 6 days. He was discharged from the Navy 3 months later on medical grounds. He moved to the San Francisco Bay Area after discharge. He worked as a bookkeeper for a small import business in Oakland from 1962 until his retirement in 1994. He married in 1965. He had 2 children. By every account available from his family, his son gave a brief statement to a maritime history researcher in 2009. He was a quiet man who lived a quiet life, and who, when asked about his Navy service, said only that he had been a diver and that the work was done and he didn't talk about it. His son told the researcher that his father never watched anything set on or in water. Not movies, not television, not the news coverage of lake accidents or ocean disasters. He changed the channel. He did not speak publicly about the August 7th dive, about what he had seen in the descent, or about the 6 days at Glenview for the remaining 41 years of his life. The official record of the Pursuit's August 1961 Lake Michigan operation is a 3-page survey summary filed with the Naval Oceanographic Office, a predecessor agency to the current Naval Meteorology and Oceanography Command. That summary describes the operation as a routine hydrographic survey of Lake Michigan's northern basin, notes the anomalous depth reading that prompted the submersible bell descent, characterizes the descent as producing data consistent with standard glacial lake geology, and recommends no further investigation of the anomalous section. The summary is signed by the Pursuit's commanding officer, a commander named Thomas Frederick Wilcox. It does not mention the 3 divers by name. It does not note that 1 diver was medically evacuated. It does not note the 14-minute air overrun that required emergency supplemental supply. It does not note that 3 divers produced 2 accounts rather than 3. It describes the dive as producing data consistent with standard glacial lake geology. Whatever Hollis and Devereaux told Commander Wilcox in their verbal debrief is not in the 3-page summary. Whatever Albert Yuen Cheng did not say is not in the 3-page summary either. The summary is accessible through the National Archives Record Group 37, the records of the Naval Oceanographic Office. The dive log for the submersible Belle descent on August 7, 1961, which would contain the telephone communications between the divers and the surface crew during the descent, is listed in the Pursuit's operational log as filed with the dive records for that operation. The dive records for that operation are listed in Record Group 37 as transferred to restricted access in September of 1961. 5 weeks after the dive, the 3-page summary is accessible. The dive records are not. Before we go further, if buried records like this one are what brought you here, hit subscribe and tell the algorithm you want more of this. This kind of research tends to disappear from recommendation feeds unless you specifically tell the platform otherwise. Now, back to the 3 divers, and to what the 2 who spoke described on the deck of the Pursuit. To understand what the Pursuit's divers descended into, we have to go back to what the Lake Michigan Trench actually is, not in the popular imagination, where lakes are simply basins of still water above sediment, but in the hydrographic and geological record that the Army Corps of Engineers has maintained for the Great Lakes since the late 19th century. Lake Michigan is a glacially carved basin, and like all glacially carved basins, it contains within its floor a complex topography of ridges, channels, and depressions produced by the movement of ice sheets over millions of years. The lake formed in its current configuration approximately 10,000 years ago as the Laurentide ice sheet retreated northward. Its basin was carved over a period of hundreds of thousands of years by successive glacial advances, and the floor of that basin reflects the full complexity of that process. Not a smooth bowl, but a landscape of ridges, sub-basins, and drainage channels now permanently submerged. The maximum documented depth of Lake Michigan is approximately 923 feet. In the Milwaukee Deep, a feature that appears in the Army Corps' hydrographic charts since at least 1910, and that represents the deepest point of a north-south channel running through the lake's central basin. What the Army Corps charts show, and what the Navy's own survey records from the late 1950s confirm, is that the Milwaukee Deep's floor does not have the smooth, gradually tapering profile that characterizes the rest of the lake's deepest sections. It has anomalous features, irregular depth readings, sonar returns that suggest structural irregularities in the lake floor. A specific section of the deep channel where the sonar profile shows what could be interpreted as a depression within the depression, a hole below the documented bottom. The Army Corps charts note these anomalies with standard survey language, irregular return, further investigation recommended, and do not resolve them. The Army Corps' hydrographic program for the Great Lakes, which has been one of the most systematic freshwater survey programs in American history, produced charts of extraordinary precision and detail for every section of the lake's floors. The irregular return notation for the Milwaukee Deep section in question appears in Corps charts from 1921, 1934, 1947, and 1955, 4 consecutive major survey updates spanning 34 years, and was never resolved into a standard depth contour in any of those updates. An anomaly that persists through 4 independent survey generations is not instrument error. It is a feature of the lake floor that the Corps' instruments consistently detected and consistently could not categorize. The Navy's 1958 and 1959 survey records, also in the National Archives, note the same anomalies and describe them as potentially significant for navigation purposes. The August 1961 dive was supposed to settle the question of what those anomalies were. It settled something, just not publicly. The accounts of Petty Officer First Class Gerald Hollis and Engineman Frank Devereaux were provided verbally on the deck of the Pursuit immediately after surfacing, and in written form 2 days later, when each man was separately interviewed by a Naval Oceanographic Office representative named Lieutenant Commander David Preston Marsh, whose name appears in the pursuit's operational log. Hollis's written account is not publicly accessible. It would be part of the restricted dive records. But Hollis did not retire quietly. He remained in the Navy until 1978, and after retirement settled in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he died in 1999. In 1991, he gave a 30-minute interview to a local maritime history newsletter called Great Lakes Depths, a small circulation publication run by a retired Coast Guard officer named Raymond Selesky. That interview was published in the newsletter's spring 1991 issue and runs to approximately 2,000 words. The interview is not in any major archive. Selesky donated his newsletter files to the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc in 2004, where they exist in an uncatalogued box designated Selesky Personal Papers. Hollis's 1991 interview describes in straightforward language what he saw in the bottom section of the descent. He describes the anomalous section of the Lake Michigan floor as a depression approximately 40 to 50 feet across, whose walls descended at a near vertical angle below the surrounding lake floor rather than tapering gradually. He describes a floor to that depression that was visible at the limit of their light's reach, approximately 60 feet below the lake bottom's general surface level, deeper than the instrument anomaly that had prompted the dive. He describes the floor of the depression as appearing, to his eye, to be composed of material different from the lake sediment that covered the surrounding floor. Not sediment, not bedrock, something that is lights illuminated differently than the surrounding substrate, more reflective, more uniform, with a regularity of surface that the surrounding sediment, in his 20 years of diving experience, did not produce. He describes Devereaux saying, on the telephone line, that it looked worked. Hollis states in the interview that he agreed with Devereaux's description. Worked, as in a surface that had been prepared by something other than geological process. At 923 feet, at the bottom of a lake that has been a lake since the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet. Hollis says that at approximately this point in the descent, Cheng went quiet on the telephone line. He stopped responding to surface communications. The surface crew asked Cheng repeatedly if he was receiving. He received. His indicators showed normal function. He simply stopped talking. They surfaced 14 minutes past the air window because Hollis says no one wanted to leave before Cheng responded. He never did. Not on the telephone line, not on the deck, not in 41 years. Frank Devereaux's account, as far as it can be reconstructed, is known through a single source, a letter that Devereaux wrote to his brother in November of 1961, 3 months after the dive, in which he describes in brief and careful terms what he had seen. Devereaux died in a car accident in 1967 at 34 years old. He had been out of the Navy since 1962 and had been working as a marine equipment technician in the Milwaukee area. His brother donated his personal papers to the Milwaukee County Historical Society in 1979. The November 1961 letter is in those papers, in the Devereaux family collection, reference MH Dev 1979-07. It is 6 paragraphs long. The first 3 cover family matters: news from home, a job he was considering, his brother's recent marriage. The 4th describes the dive at some length, the descent, the darkness below 400 feet, the way the lights created a cone of visibility in the absolute black of the deep lake. The 5th describes what Devereaux saw in the depression. The 6th says, "I don't know what it was. I know what it looked like. It looked like a floor someone had put down a long time ago. I'm not going to say that to the Navy again. Again, He had said it to the Navy once. In his verbal debrief on the deck of the Pursuit and in his written interview with Lieutenant Commander Marsh, he had described what he saw. He had used, by Hollis's account of the shared telephone line, the word worked, and he had learned, in the 3 months between the dive and the letter, that saying it to the Navy a second time was not something he intended to do. Devereaux was 28 years old when he wrote that letter. He had been a naval diver for 6 years. He was describing a professional observation he had made in the course of his duties, and he was telling his brother that he had told his employer once and was not going to tell them again. That is not the letter of a man who thought he had seen something routine. This is not the first time the Navy's deep water survey operations have produced classified results from an anomalous freshwater feature. Lake Superior, 1958, a naval survey team using sonar to chart the lake's central basin identified a formation in the deepest section of the Superior, deep at approximately 1,030 feet, that produced a sonar return inconsistent with the surrounding bedrock profile. The survey team's findings were filed with the Naval Oceanographic Office. The relevant section of the survey record was classified in 1959. The Army Corps charts for Lake Superior, published in 1961, show the anomalous section with a standard contour notation. The 1958 irregular return notation that appeared in the Navy's survey is not incorporated into the Corps chart revision. Lake Huron, 1963, a bottom survey conducted in connection with a cable-laying operation in the Georgian Bay Channel produced instrument readings at depth that the operation's chief hydrographer described in a project report, filed with the contractor and accessible at the University of Toronto's map library, as indicating a feature at the lake floor whose profile he could not reconcile with the known geological survey of the area. The cable was routed to avoid the feature. The project report notes it as an anomaly requiring further investigation. No further investigation was conducted. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern of unexplained deep water features in the Great Lakes whose documentation is consistently produced, consistently filed, and consistently not incorporated into the standard public cartographic record of those lakes. The anomalous sonar returns from the Milwaukee Deep's floor were not investigated further by any published Naval or Army Corps survey after the August 1961 dive. The Army Corps' updated hydrographic charts for Lake Michigan, published in 1968, show the Milwaukee Deep with the same irregular return notation that appeared in earlier charts, without revision or elaboration. The lake's maximum documented depth remains listed at 923 feet in every publicly accessible source. What the descent data from the submersible Bell, the actual depth readings collected during the 40-minute descent on August 7, 1961, recorded is in the restricted dive records that were transferred in September 1961. The 3-page summary describes the descent as consistent with standard glacial geology. The summary was written by Commander Wilcox. Hollis and Devereaux had told Wilcox what they saw. Wilcox wrote, "Consistent with standard glacial geology." That decision, to describe what two experienced naval divers said looked like a worked floor as consistent with standard glacial geology, was made within 48 hours of the dive and remains the only official characterization of what was found at the bottom of Lake Michigan on August 7, 1961. The Naval Meteorology and Oceanography Command, successor to the Naval Oceanographic Office, has never adequately addressed the restricted status of the August 1961 dive records, including the submersible Bell's descent log and the telephone communications between the divers and the surface crew during the descent. It has never explained why Albert Yuen Cheng was medically evacuated within 4 hours of surfacing from a dive that the official summary describes as routine. It has never explained why Frank Devereaux told his brother in November 1961 that he was not going to tell the Navy again what he had seen, implying he had told them once and found the experience instructive. Why would the written summary of a dive whose official characterization is consistent with standard glacial geology have its supporting dive records transferred to restricted access within 5 weeks of the dive? Why would a routine survey result prompt the medical evacuation of one of 3 divers? Why would an experienced Navy diver describe, in a letter to his brother 3 months after a classified dive, that he did not intend to repeat to the Navy what he had already told them? If what he had told them was, as the official summary states, consistent with standard glacial lake geology? The honest answer is that we do not know what is at the bottom of the Milwaukee Deep. What we know is what the documented record tells us when it is read without the official summary's interpretive overlay. 2 divers described a surface that looked worked to an experienced naval eye. A 3rd diver was medically evacuated and never spoke publicly about the experience. The records that would allow an independent assessment of what was seen were classified within 5 weeks, and the official summary was written by the commanding officer who had heard the divers' verbal accounts and chose to characterize their observations as consistent with standard glacial lake geology. These records survive: the newsletter interview, the Milwaukee County Historical Society letter, the 3-page summary, the restricted status notation, because a retired Coast Guard officer kept his newsletter files, and a brother kept personal papers, and a Naval Archive logs transfers, even when it doesn't want the transfers noticed. Subscribe and share this with someone who has stood on the shore of Lake Michigan and thought it was just a lake. Next week, I am pulling the Navy's sonar record from the US Pursuit's 3 days at anchor above the Milwaukee Deep and cross-referencing the depth anomaly coordinates against the Army Corps hydrographic chart revisions from 1955 to 1975. There is one revision to those charts in 1963, 2 years after the Pursuit's dive. That changed the contour notation for a specific section of the Milwaukee Deep without any published explanation or survey data to account for the change. The 1963 revision removed the irregular return notation that had appeared in every previous chart. It replaced it with a standard depth contour. Someone in 1963 decided that the Milwaukee Deep was no longer irregular. I have both charts,